All right. So it's February 17th, 2021. I want to welcome Fatima Khan and John Lindsay Poland from the American Friends Service Committee. The Berkeley Society of Friends is hosting this. We are sponsored by this Social Environmental Action Committee and the Outreach and Nurture Committee. So I wanted to just have a few minutes of silence. Then I'd like to do an introduction. And then we'll go ahead and let Fatima, excuse me, present and do QA so she can go home. And then we'll have John to present. Okay, sound like a plan? All right. Finally, we're here. I've been looking forward to this for several weeks. I wanted to introduce Fatima Khan. She is a Bay Area native. Fatima, excuse me, I beg your pardon. A Bay Area native who works in the American Friends Service Committee Oakland office. She has a BA in criminal justice and an Master's of Education concentrated in equity and social justice. Fatima has held restorative community conferencing circles through a youth diversion program in both San Francisco and Alameda County. Fatima is currently working on California legislation to reduce reliance on incarceration. I will introduce John when it's his turn. Okay, so take it away.
Could you give me, can you make me host so I could share my screen?
So, Jeannie, you're
Yes.
going to do that? Okay, very good.
Now try it.
There you go.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. So John and myself are going to talk about some issues around police militarization and mass incarceration. What I'm going to do first is go ahead and talk about the mass incarceration piece of what I've been working on here at AFSC. So in our last legislative cycle in the year 2020, we were able to pass something called the California Racial Justice Act. And what is now law, this bill, is the first that we've had in this country that is on such a large scale. So, for example, in North Carolina, in 2009, they actually did pass something called the Racial Justice Act, but it was very specific to folks that are being given the death penalty. And then it was later repealed in 2013. And then in the state of Kentucky, there was also something called the Racial Justice Act. And again, it was very specific to the death penalty. And that was also unfortunately repealed in 2013. So what we did here in California is we created something called the Racial Justice Act. And essentially what the goal of this bill was to prevent the state, and I also have it on the screen for y'all to read, it's to prohibit the state from basically seeking any type of criminal conviction or imposing some sort of sentence based on someone's ethnicity, their race, their national origin. And the reason that this was important, this bill, this law is important, is because we know that there's systemic racism in the way that, in our courts, in the way that people are sentenced and convicted. We know that a Black man is 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white person. This is information that is publicized for everyone to see. So we know that our criminal justice system isn't fair in the way that we incarcerate people, and this bill's aim was to address that. So what it does is there's language in the bill that basically says if you can prove that in your case there was some sort of racial bias that's what lended or factored in such a harsh or long sentence, or in sentencing at all, conviction at all for the defendant, they are able to challenge their conviction. So here we have these are the 5 different ways that you can challenge, that a defendant can challenge their case. So if they can prove that there's any racial bias, and that's for anyone that is involved in the case, whether it be whether it be the judge, it could be someone from the jury, it could be a witness. If they are showing some sort of racial bias, whether it is intentional or unintentional, that becomes one remedy of a way to challenge your conviction. Another thing is racial discriminate language. So that's something that we see very often in courtrooms. I'm sure some of you have heard the term super predator, or equating the defendant to some sort of animal or something that is not human, and that is done intentionally to kind of create some bias in how you see that person, right? Because the courts want to get good numbers, they want to incarcerate people. So when you use racially discriminatory language in terms of even the jury, you have now created some bias in their mind. Another way is statistical disparities. So basically, if you're able to show that one race is disproportionately charged for a specific crime over another race, that's another way of showing and challenging there's some racial disparity in your case. And then also statistical disparities in your sentencing. So how long of a sentence your sentences versus someone of a different race. So there are 5 different ways to challenge or to prove that there is some racial bias in your case. So unfortunately, when we were working on this bill in 2020, this bill, the Racial Justice Act, it applied to all folks that are in prison initially, and for a majority of offenses as well. Because we ran this bill during a legislative cycle, 2020, which was very burdened financially, right? Because we have the COVID-19 virus, created a lot of financial strains, and this bill was doing a lot. So in order to get the bill passed, when it went through various committees of legislation, they removed retroactivity from the bill. So what that does is, for the folks that are currently inside being caged, they are not able to challenge their conviction, even if they're not allowed to use the Racial Justice Act to challenge their conviction, because they removed retroactivity from the language in the bill in 2020. So we thought it was still important to keep the bill, so we worked and we moved forward with it nonetheless. And what we are doing now is we're working on the bill called AB 256, Racial Justice for All. And the point of this is it's the same thing. It essentially just adds retroactivity into kind of like, it's like a trailer bill. We want to have retroactivity applied for the Racial Justice Act, and this is the method in which we are going to hopefully get that done. And the reason it is important that we have retroactivity is if we are willing to admit that the way that we incarcerate people, the way that we convict and sentence people is disproportionate and racist, then we have to address what has already happened. So there's so many people that are sitting now in cages who potentially would be able to challenge their case in some way, if the Racial Justice Act did apply to them. And unfortunately, at the moment, it is not. The Racial Justice Act 2020, which just passed, became effective January 1st, 2021 for folks moving forward. So now in the event that you go to court and you're fighting some sort of trial, your court process, if there's any element of racial bias that you can prove within the 5 remedies, you can now challenge your current trial. But if you are in jail at the moment, if you're in prison right now, you cannot use the Racial Justice Act as a remedy to relinquish your sentence or to challenge your sentence. Does that make sense? Cool. So that is what we are working on for this legislative cycle in terms of the mass incarceration work. By giving folks a way to challenge any racial discrimination in their sentence or their conviction, we hope that we're going to see a drastic decrease in our prison population. So this is one of the methods that we are trying to create some durable mechanisms and chip away at means of incarcerating people. We have not been heard, so because this is a state legislation, it has to go through various committees. The first stop is going to be the Assembly Public Safety Committee. And that's basically the subcommittee that is going to look at the Racial Justice Act for all and kind of decide if it poses any issues around public safety for people, for folks that are living in California. Usually, we have some good relationships with people in the public safety committee. But despite having good relationships with various legislators and senators, we do know that because 2020 was so sensitive of a year, that 2021 has a lot of residual impact in terms of financial strain and things like that. So we anticipate that it's going to be very difficult to pass, but we have a lot of really great co-sponsors, and the author for the bill, Assemblymember Osh Kalra, representing San Jose, is really dedicated to the work, and we're excited for this. So do we have any questions around the Racial Justice Act before I move on to just some other pieces of what I'm working on?
Yes, I have a question. I was wondering how the Racial Justice Act defines what are statistical disparities in the charging for crimes. Because it would seem to me that if different racial groups have different levels of unemployment, you would kind of expect disparities in the amount of crime committed by different ones. And so it might not be unfair for them to be charged more for crimes. I mean, I'm sure there are all sorts of unfair things in the justice system, but I just wondered how statistical disparities in charging is defined in the Racial Justice Act.
How statistical disparities are defined?
Yeah, in terms of the charging for crimes. I can see how it would be defined in terms of convictions, but how about in the charging for crimes?
I don't think I'm understanding your question too much.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Let's say you have 2 groups of people, A and B, and group A has 50% unemployment and group B has 0% unemployment. You'd expect group A to have commit a lot more crimes. And are you saying that it's unfair that the group that commits more crimes is charged more than the group that doesn't commit crimes?
No, but there's potentially some disparities in the fact that one group of people for some reason are employed and another group is not. So
oh yeah, that's totally unfair, but that's different.
Right.
No.
So to answer your question, no, but when you're looking at statistical disparities, you're looking at it, you're putting it on a certain scale. So it's making up, does that make sense? It's sort of like per capita. So it's still addressing that concern in that gap that you're speaking of.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Connie.
Yeah, you say we are bringing this bill forward. Is we the AFSC or some part of AFSC or AFSC and others, or who is the we?
Yeah, good question. So AFSC Healing Justice, yes, we are co-sponsors on the bill, as well as the ACLU, as well as the Ella Baker Center, Silicon Valley Debug, Initiate Justice, Chilra, and League of Women Voters, as well as Next Gen, which is a policy group, all based within California.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Just unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have one question here. The Racial Justice Act, I assume, just took effect at the beginning of January, the one that was passed last year. So we don't yet know, I think, really how it's going to be implemented or what, how people make use of this bill.
Right.
Yet?
So what we're doing is we've been holding community trainings, so various types of community trainings. One for just regular folks to understand what this bill does in California, and then another bill, another training directed more towards attorneys to understand potentially how it can impact their clients. And we also have to begin training judges. When I say we, I don't mean AFSC or co-sponsors, but whichever body is in charge of training judges on new laws and things and how to implement them. So we have a body in the Racial Justice Coalition called the Implementation Group, and they are kind of responsible for monitoring how it's being implemented, if it's being implemented. So for example, there was a case that we found in the Bay Area, and they're not going to be using any of the Racial Justice Act remedies in this case as it proceeds forward, or when it was proceeding forward. But what we're doing is we're using certain sample cases in the Bay Area to look at how it would be potentially implemented so we can begin to implement it. So on one end, we have trainings. On the community side, we're training lawyers and attorneys. And then there's also the legal side in which the judges have to get trained, and there's procedurally, there has to be a way to go about challenging the conviction as of January 1st, 2021. So these are all things that we are monitoring and trying to plan out as we move forward.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right, let's go ahead.
Lindsay had her hand up.
Okay. Excuse me, I didn't see that. Wendy, please.
Thank you. In this AB 256, are there any of our local legislators yet signed on as co-sponsors?
There are. I don't have the list in front of me, but there are, and I can provide that to you, but there are Bay Area legislators that have signed on as co-authors, meaning they do support the bill.
And you're still attracting others? Is that something that's helpful to work on or not yet?
In terms of like
if I contacted my legislator to say, I want you to work on this or to sponsor it, is that a helpful step?
That'll be really helpful, not just yet. So what we're doing at the moment is we have something called a target tracker, which is this long document Excel spreadsheet and we have all the various legislators and how they voted for the bill last year, and how we potentially see them voting on the bill, the retroactive bill this year. And we're figuring out who are key targets. And then what we'll be doing is reaching out to various constituents of those districts for those members. So you are a little ahead of the game right now, but we will most definitely be getting to that. We just introduced this bill January 15th, and we're waiting for a date to know when we're going to go into the Assembly Public Safety Committee.
Thank you very much.
So what I can do is, I don't have slides for this, but I can move on to sort of what else we're working on, which is closing is our prison closures. So in, let's say our Governor Newsom mentioned that he wanted to close 2 prisons in the next 3 years. And we believe that we can close 5 prisons in the next 5 years. So in order to do that, what we've done is we're working with a lot of different organizations across California, and we have created something called the Prison Closure Memo Report. And it's basically a long document that explains why we need to close prisons and how we're going to do that, as well as creating some sort of criteria on which prisons we should close and why, and the criteria for which prisons we should close and why capture the voices of people that are currently incarcerated or have been incarcerated at some point before. So what we plan to do is create this memo. It's also supporting various policies such as ending life without parole, elder parole, and things like that. So we're trying to push for other legislative policies because they're going to help decrease the prison population, thus helping us move away from needing to have so many prisons open to begin with. So we're trying to, this memo basically explains what's wrong with our prison system, why we should move away from it, such as the financial costs. It's not good for public safety. The institution is racist. So we have all these various reasons as to why we should close prisons. And then we're also talking about how we're going to get there, what policies we need to put in place to make it so we can decarcerate and then close facilities down. And then what we're going to be doing eventually, once we have this report finalized, is we're going to be meeting with various legislators in order to gain support around wanting to close these prisons. So what we do is we've been participating in a lot of different hearings, state hearings, in which they're asking CDCR about their budget and about how they're responding to COVID-19 inside and all these different things. While we're in those hearings, we hear legislators' interests in wanting to close prisons, but they're always asking for a plan. They want a plan to close the prisons because you have to consider what you're going to do with the institution, which institution to close, what about people's jobs. And CDCR is not providing any type of plan on how to close prisons. Of course not. It's not in their best interest, right? On how are we going to close prisons. So that's why we, the community members, have taken steps ourselves to create some sort of plan, some sort of advocacy tool that's going to allow us to have some voice in decision making on what prisons do get closed. And eventually what we're going to be doing is mobilizing people. So we have different subgroups within this larger prison closure memo. We have little working subgroups. So we're looking at power mapping. So which legislators or which senators we need to talk to and move and get on our side. We have things like public education work groups. So how do we educate the public on issues of prison closure. Why is it even important? And how do we get people interested in this work who are not really in this work anyways? And for people who are not prison abolitionists, how do we get people to understand that we can move away from prisons in a way that still creates justice and love and harmony for our communities? There's also a social media section. So this is a very big project that a lot of people are working on, and there's a lot of different moving pieces, but it's because we recognize that if we want to move away from prisons, we have to, as we chip away from the current structure, we also have to advocate and establish structures and systems that we know are going to work for us. So that's kind of what we're doing. We're aiming at tearing down one while also offering solutions and methods for things that we know that work well for our communities.
Any other questions for Fatima? Did you have other slides?
We have other slides, but John's going to go over those slides.
Okay, very good. So I really appreciate all of the work that you're doing, and especially coming to explain that to us tonight. I know all of us Quakers are on your side. So bravo. And any other last minute questions? Okay, thank you. I hope you can go home now.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure whatever John is going to say is going to be even better. So lots of places for people to plug in and continue the work in their communities. Thank you.
Good, thank you, and good night. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to explain, giving the intro to John. John Lindsay Poland is the Healing Justice Co-Director for AFSC's San Francisco office. He's written about, researched, and organized action for human rights and demilitarization of US policy, especially in Latin America, for more than 30 years. He left his studies at Harvard University to participate in an international disarmament, organizing and to accompany Central Americans threatened with political violence. From 1989 to 2014, he served the Interfaith Pacifist Organization Fellowship of Reconciliation as coordinator of the Task Force on Latin America and the Caribbean, and as research director, and founded the FOR, Fellowship of Reconciliation Colombia Peace Team. So welcome, John.
Well, thank you so much, Barb, and thank you all for spending a good part of your evening tuning into topics that are not easy. They're definitely not easy to hold in our hearts and our minds and think about how we relate to them. What is our responsibility in response to them? What contribution we can make, and also to recognize the pain of so many people who are currently suffering from policing, from the criminal justice system, on all sides, in a system that is really not healing, which is why we call our program Healing Justice. We're not about criminal justice, we're about healing justice. So I'm going to talk about policing and about the local jail here in Alameda County. I've been working for AFSC, and I'm so glad to see Stephen McNeil here, because he was my mentor in this organization for the first several years that I worked for AFSC. And I know he's up very, very late right now, so thank you, an extra thanks to you. And so we are addressing, you heard Fatima talk about the state level, California level work that we're doing. We're also working locally in the Bay Area, and we're doing stuff related to police militarization, as well as to incarceration at the county level. So just to back up a little bit, many of you know this history, but I think often when we have these debates about police, people immediately go to, what if there's a rape? What if there's a mass shooting? And I think it's important to ground ourselves in the understanding of the histories out of which modern policing has emerged. That public and citizen safety was not the primary objectives and goals of policing, whether we're talking about the slave patrols in the South that eventually morphed into 24-hour policing agencies, or if we're talking about the Texas Rangers, or if we're talking about the role of city police in putting down labor protests, or other kinds of protests, the early feminists and many others, gay rights activists. There's so many pieces of history where the role of policing was social control. So I think that context is really important when we think about what is the role of policing today, and not just think about, let's think about the worst case scenario, which is a very, very, very small portion of modern policing. And another way to frame this is, what does community safety look like? What is it that makes us feel safe? How do we understand our own safety? And when we begin to frame it that way, we think about things, earlier someone mentioned employment. We think about health. We think about our accountability to each other, which is a very different way of understanding what it is we need. What do we need in order to be safe as a community and thrive? And so that's where, when we begin to think about, and you all have heard about the slogan of defunding police, we're not just talking about taking away, we're talking about investing. And increasingly, police in municipal and county and even state and federal budgets, but especially local budgets, have taken an increasing amount of the share of public monies. And that is where safety is constructed, primarily, is at the local level. And if the way we are doing that is by investing in armed police, then our priorities are likely to be distorted. And so we want to invest in other things that will help create safety. We can talk more about that. But so I like to, think about racist policing in a number of different ways, because a lot of times people think, that guy who killed George Floyd, right? If we could only get rid of those bad apples. But there's a lot of different ways in which it manifests. And so one of the most important ways, I believe, is in the mission. That is, what is the mandate of modern police? Because even police often complain about the fact that civilians, not police, civilians, have assigned them increasing numbers of social, again, these are social control, but they are addressing social issues or social problems. So the lack of housing, the lack of mental health care that's based in the community. Basically, you have to go to jail to get mental health care in many respects. Or when people are abusing substances, or when there's conflict in schools. All of these things are then assigned police in a way that their mandate has ballooned in ways that has led to more both dysfunctional addressing of social problems and brutality, because you're sending a guy with a gun and a badge to deal with something that shouldn't really get that kind of response. Then who are our police? And increasingly, police are not living in the community where they are working. I live in Oakland. More than 90% of the officers in OPD do not live in Oakland. So they are operating as an outsider. They're not operating in a territory where they have an investment with a home and a family to live there. And that increasingly makes communities see them also as outsiders, as occupiers. The training is often, again, it's for the worst case scenario. It's for that thing that nobody ever wants to see. But if your training revolves around that worst case scenario, then the vast majority of situations that you encounter as a cop, you are going to see in that lens, what if they have a gun? What if they're out to attack me? I have to use the training I've gotten in order to prevent that from happening. And that often means using much greater force, or not addressing people really where they are at. Then there's the equipment, which increasingly is military grade, and I'm going to come back to that. And then there's the fact that when police transgress, the rules are different than for the rest of us. And they're literally different. The actual laws are different. You know, in California, there's a California Policeman's Bill of Rights, which gives police additional rights if they do something wrong. So all of those things combine into a kind of cocktail that makes with the situation that we have now. So now let me focus on the equipment, because I want to talk a little bit more about what we're doing about that in the AFSC. And we could draw this timeline much longer. You know, when Southern sheriff's deputies first got 38 revolvers, it was on the premise that Negroes, when they were high on cocaine, could deflect regular 22 bullets. And so therefore they had to up their caliber. So it was always based on this racist premise that you need more firepower in order to deal with this threat. Now, in the case of this type of equipment, it's also connected to the United States' overseas wars, because when those wars draw down and wind down, there's all this surplus equipment, has nowhere to go. The Pentagon, when troops were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, they had an inventory problem. They didn't know where to put things. So they offered them to police. I mean, the law already existed to do that, but then the number of tanks and other types of military equipment that were given to police just grew exponentially during that period. And then you have the uprising in Ferguson in 2014 in the response to the killing of Michael Brown and the subsequent exoneration of the police officer responsible. And in response to that, President Obama issued an executive order which controlled the surplus Pentagon equipment that was going to police departments all across the country. So we're talking about billions of dollars worth of equipment going to literally thousands of police departments across the country. It didn't stop the program, but it put some limits on it. And it also, very importantly, created a mandate for local civilian elected bodies to have a say in that equipment, so that it's not just a direct relationship between the police department and the Pentagon. And that's very important, and we'll come back to that. So how is this equipment used in policing? Right? Well, there's not a war like you might think of in Afghanistan, right? Not exactly. A lot of it is used in crowd control, and a lot of it is used by SWAT teams. SWAT teams have grown enormously in the United States in the last 25 years. It used to be, again, for the worst case scenario, but then cities and even small towns develop SWAT teams that increasingly are used to serve warrants. They're not used for active shooter situations or other similar things. They're used to serve a warrant on someone who is believed to have a firearm, or might have one, maybe, or maybe he's part of a group of someone who has a firearm. I mean, it keeps going, it keeps extending. And the racial makeup of the people who are impacted are greatly disproportionately Black and Latino. And I want to say, address something that Mr. Milliken said, which is, first of all, that there is disproportionate unemployment among people of color is not exactly fair. If we're gonna gauge this by fairness, that is not exactly fair. But a lot of what this is based on is not how many people are committing crimes. It's what happens when they commit a crime. If you look at the number of stops that Berkeley Police Department does, and Berkeley is not unique by any measure, the number of people of color who are stopped is greatly disproportionate to their role in the population. And the number of times they are charged with a crime is much less than for the white people who are stopped. In other words, the unjustifiable stops by police of people of color are more and disproportionate in compared to white people. And it's the same thing with charging. So you have overcharging by the DA, and that has a racial component. So we could talk more about that, but I just wanted to mention that. So what is the equipment that they're getting? They're getting armored vehicles. This is not just happening through the Pentagon Surplus Program. There's also the Department of Homeland Security has a cash grant program that allows police departments to obtain vehicles and other things, not just armored vehicles, through cash grants that are then used to purchase things. So Oakland, for example, has a vehicle like this. This is not theirs, but it's like this. And that they got through in 2008 through a grant from Homeland Security. And there's a lot of different sources. Most of it, actually, especially for the less expensive things, is from cities and counties' own budgets. So those are, from the general fund, for example. Okay, so what is the other things that are part of these militarized equipment? Berkeley, for example, has this type of so-called less lethal launcher, fires a baton round, which definitely will stop someone and temporarily disable them. It might not penetrate the skin, but it can definitely harm you. It's not like a rubber bullet, it's a bigger thing than that. You can kind of see some examples down below. But most departments have these so-called less lethal rounds and less lethal launchers. Sometimes they're also used to fire chemical agents like tear gas. It depends on the particular firearm. The departments also have assault rifles. So for you and me, for all of us here in this Zoom room, it is illegal in California to purchase and to possess an assault rifle. There's some exceptions if you bought it back in the 1980s, but in general, for us, it is illegal to own these things, but not for law enforcement, right? So law enforcement owns them. Some of them they get through the Pentagon Surplus Program, but most of them they buy. It's not a huge part of a budget. If you have 1,000 officer force and half of them have an assault rifle, then you're maybe talking about $500,000 compared, Oakland has a $330 million police budget. So, but these are not visible. They're not regulated. Nobody knows how many they have. Nobody knows how often they're using them, where they're using them, on whom, in what circumstances, and so on. Then this is a very recent technological development, which can be used as a crowd control device, but it can also be used to communicate. And so Oakland has one, Berkeley has one. I know there's some other people in other cities here, but I don't know about whether they have them. A lot more departments are getting them. And so it can be used as a communication device. Like if you're in a rescue and you want to communicate 100 or 200 yards away, it can communicate clearly a voice, right? Or instructions or something. But it can also be used to emanate a very high-pitched sound that is very loud. If it's in a crowd, it will harm the people in that crowd. It will damage hearing. It will make people fall over. It will make them throw up. New York Police Department has actually been sued successfully in the federal courts as a result of excessive use of force by these things. So now, going back to what happened after Obama issued this executive order, it only applied to Pentagon surplus equipment. And it controlled some, it banned a few things that most departments don't use, like bayonets and tracked tanks. But on the whole, it let things go. That was rescinded by Trump after he came in. And I'll just, one update is that President Biden was going to restore this executive order on January 26th. They announced they were going to do that, and then for some reason they didn't. And the White House has not said what their plan is. But that's at the federal level. Now, here locally, this is a Bearcat that belongs to the Oakland Police Department, and it was used in response to a homeless man, Joshua Pollock, who in North Oakland was asleep in an area between two houses. He had a firearm in his hand next to him, but he was asleep. The OPD deployed the Bearcat. They had these guys. The guy on top has an assault rifle. Several others did also. They were there for 35 minutes. He starts to wake. His head starts to come up. They're telling him to drop the gun, and then they're telling him to move. So they gave him some contradictory instructions, and then he kind of went down, and then his head came up again, and then they shot him and killed him. And so the Bearcat in this instance was not being used to protect officers from gunfire. Joshua Pollock never pointed his gun, never shot his gun, never. But they were using it as a shooting platform. So I can come back to that more. But at the state level, there was a bill 2.5 years ago to regulate these weapons in every police and sheriff's department in the state of California, meaning that if police are using these pieces of equipment, that they would have to create a use policy for them, an impact statement, and that would need to be submitted to their local elected officials for approval. And then if it's approved, then they would have to report on its use every year. And that was vetoed by then Governor Brown. It has now been reintroduced a week ago, or less than a week ago, I think, by Assemblymember David Hsu from San Francisco. Thank you, San Franciscans. It does the same thing. It's almost exactly the same thing. And it's at the very beginning of the legislative session, so we're not sure, what its prospects are, but I'll be learning more on Monday, actually. So locally, at the same time, in Oakland, there is an ordinance that does the same thing. It says for these types of equipment, the police need to basically justify their use, create a use policy, which helps them and us as a community and the police commission and the city council and the department think through what are the legitimate uses of this equipment. Under what circumstances? What are the prohibited uses? What should be taken into account? What kind of training should there be? And then if it's approved, there needs to be reporting. Okay, how many do you have? Who is authorized to use them? How often has it been used? Where? Is it used more often in the flats than in the hills? Under what circumstances, and so on. So Berkeley has a very similar one, which on March 1st, well, I'll come back to that, will be considered by Berkeley's Public Safety Committee. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna try and rush through this. Another big piece of our work is around decarceration at the county level, right? So this is the jail, not the state prison where people have been sentenced, but at the jail where most people have not yet been tried. And so what's happening at that level? So this is the number of people in the county jail since in the last 10 years. And you can see that it's gone down considerably. If you went back further, it would be even higher. It was like 4,500 in the late 2000s. And it keeps going down. And yet the sheriff's budget keeps going up. The jail budget keeps going up. So that led us to start a campaign to audit the sheriff, which has now become transformed into a campaign to decarcerate the county. And I'll talk more about that. Now, most of these people have not been sentenced. That means they are legally innocent. In Alameda County, 96% of the prisoners in Santa Rita jail have not yet been tried. And that has gotten only higher during the pandemic. Alameda County is the red bar here on the far left. That's compared to all the other counties in California. So Alameda has a close to the worst percentage of the percentage of untried people in the county jail, for multiple reasons. I mean, the courts are part of the issue. The DA is part of the issue because, again, overcharging. When you overcharge, there's going to be bail. There's also about 1/5 of the county jail population are federal prisoners. Now, the conditions in the jail are really bad. And these are people who have died in the county jail in the last few years, or pictures of them. Alameda County has a very high rate of in-custody deaths in the county jail. There's many different circumstances for those deaths, but it's a problem. It's really a problem. In my experience, the county sheriff office has a culture of indifference and of cruelty. Basically, these people must have done something, so it's their problem. They're in jail, what do you expect? That's kind of the attitude on a lot of the people in the county sheriff's office. Not everybody, but a lot of people. So what are our goals? We want to get people out of the jail. We want to drastically reduce the number. I mean, this wouldn't even reduce the number by all the people who are not yet sentenced. I mean, we were reading the Black Panthers program the other night, and they were like, anybody who's not yet been sentenced shouldn't be in jail, right? Okay, they should be out. And we want to decarcerate, we want to divest from this in the budget and invest in community health. About 1/4 of the prison population in Alameda County has a serious mental illness. And they are not getting the services at the community level that they need, which means that they're much more likely to get into conflict. Their mental health is much more likely to deteriorate, and they're much more likely to end up in jail. And when they do go to jail, their health deteriorates. They tend to spend longer in jail. They're more likely to be abused by other prisoners or by the staff. In general, they have a really bad time. So it just makes so much more sense to invest in that kind of community mental health. So we have a number of different strategies around that. There is authority in the public health department to release in a pandemic. There is authority to release, to order releases as a result of the emergency, because people can't socially distance in a jail. They're in pods, they're in dormitory settings, and it's not possible to socially distance effectively. Another is to, as I was hinting, to invest more in community-based mental health programs, build the community capacity for that. There's a whole process around that we could talk more about. The federal leased beds, wouldn't really decarcerate on the whole. It would move people out. It would reduce the number of people at Santa Rita. And then there's a lot of things that the district attorney does that increase the number of people in the county jail that can be addressed in a lot of different ways. So diversion at the street level, at the level of mental health treatment or law enforcement, but also at the level of the DA in the charging, or at the level of the courts. And Alameda County has several courts that are being underutilized for people who have a substance abuse problem, or they have a mental illness, or other issues that could be addressed much more effectively without sending them to Santa Rita jail. So there's some things coming up on Monday, the March 1st. The Berkeley Public Safety Committee is going to be considering this controlled equipment ordinance. And then in the coming weeks, there will be more going on around these ordinances for demilitarizing the police in Oakland and Berkeley and in California. I didn't write it here, but the Decarceration Alameda County is open to more participation. We have 4 different work groups. We have a budget legislative work group. We have a communications group. We have an outreach group and an in-reach group that's working with people inside the jail and their families. And it's an enormous task we're undertaking. So more participation is definitely welcome. And then I just wanted to note, where you can find out more information on some of these things, not all of them, but some of them, and where you can contact us. I'm happy to talk with folks or, correspond at any point. So I will leave it there. And thank you for listening so long.
So John, we have until 8:30, and I just wanted to see if anybody has questions for John, and then we have one other topic to discuss. So who's raising their hands? Let me see if I can find you. Thank you, John.
So
Connie, please go ahead.
You call on me?
Yes, I am. Please go ahead, Connie.
Okay. Is there any punishment for a police officer who shoots and kills somebody that they suspect might be a wrongdoer?
What would you consider to be punishment, Connie?
Trial?
A criminal trial? Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. There can be wrongful shootings that are considered to be criminal homicides. One of the problems is that district attorneys who have the responsibility to conduct such prosecutions generally have very close relationships with law enforcement and are unlikely to conduct those prosecutions, even when the case is very strong. So, there's a lot of pressure now on DA Nancy O'Malley to conduct a prosecution for the killing of Stephen Taylor in San Leandro last year. I can't remember the latest. I believe it's been reopened because that was an unnecessary shooting, right? Similarly, Oscar Grant, who was killed by BART police officers over 10 years ago, there is some new evidence that shows that some of the officers really set up the conditions for carrying out that homicide, including slamming his head against the pavement. And so there's now kind of a whole campaign, really, which has been endorsed by Oakland City Council and by others, to reopen that prosecution against some of those officers. It's an uphill battle. Of course, we want to prevent those things from happening. The reason why I asked you what is punishment is, I'm not sure that punishment would be my measure of justice, always. I mean, I support the families that say they want a criminal prosecution of these officers when they have carried out a murder. I do support that. But on the whole, I'm also interested in other forms of justice besides punishment. And so anyway, that's just a question that kind of stays with me. Did I answer your question?
Well, sort of, but it opens up a lot of new questions. And
These things usually do. These things usually do.
Stephen McNeil, go ahead.
Not to make your life more difficult, but is there any movement in terms of accountability and changing the police Bill of Rights in Sacramento?
I've heard people talk about it. I've never seen a legislator introduce anything about it. It's certain that the pushback from the police lobby would be very, very, very strong. So, any legislator that's going to do it is going to want to get some ducks in a row. And yeah, and probably what they would do was they would try and take a piece of it, right? I think the sovereign immunity of law enforcement might be one thing that, because some of the courts have started to challenge it too. It's not an area that I have focused on a lot, so I can't really speak with any confidence about it. I hear people talk about it sometimes, but I haven't seen a move, if you will. But why don't you say, Stephen, why you raised that? What do you want to say? What that Bill of Rights is?
Well, I think that's one of the stumbling blocks in terms of accountability. And maybe I'll try and talk to Scott Weiner. He seems to drop bills, every day. So maybe he might take it on.
Also, John, someone in the chat asked, or David Rushman said, how about other counties in the Bay Area, like Solano County?
Yeah, I saw that. I'm not sure what the question is about Solano County. Is the question what is the jail situation there, or what? Of course, Solano County has Vallejo in it, and Vallejo's police department is a nightmare. It's a total nightmare, and really has the city, under, what do you call it, under the table? I don't know, over their knee. So, but that's Vallejo. I'm not sure if that's what the question was. I'm not sure what the question was going.
Yes, that's where I live, and that's where the question came from. Because
and what do you?
It is horrible here.
Yeah. So, what are you?
Well, I'm just
what do you see as a
wondering,
starting point? Like in Vallejo, what do you, for you, in your experience and the way you interact with Vallejo, what do you see as a possible starting point for addressing what's going on there?
I think it has to be much greater than the city. It has to be statewide or countywide. Countywide isn't enough. I think statewide. That's all. I mean, I'm just. It's so horrible here. Yeah.
I mean, I always like to look at where does the money come from, right? So these guys, they want to be paid, and Vallejo cops are paid quite well relative to the economics of Vallejo.
They are.
And that's in general in California. That's very true. As a blue state where the cops are unionized, they're very well paid. As civil servants, they are very well paid. When you count, not just the salary, but also the overtime and the pension and the other benefits, it's quite generous. And so we could talk about, oh, well, because they're risking their lives every day. Well, compared to other professions, they're not necessarily risking their lives as much every day as some other professions, and yet their compensation is enormous.
Well, in our city, there was so much nepotism, as far as I understand it, that created the crisis of our city budget when the Navy left. And I've only been here 5 or 6 years, but I've done some work with the city, and I think that's the reality, that the police and the fire just kind of destroyed the economy of the city. I don't know how much.
There's an amazing account. I think it was in the New Yorker about the Vallejo police and what happened there. I highly recommend, if we can find the link during this conversation, it would be great to pass on. But
it was just a few months ago.
Yeah, that's right. If you look at where the money comes from, because that could be where you find the leverage that the county or the state might have with Vallejo or for any other jurisdiction that's represented here, right? So for example, we're looking at the Alameda County for most of its budget depends on state and federal money. That's where the money comes from. So if the state legislature does an audit of the county jail or of the mental health system in Alameda County, it has a lot of leverage because that's where so much of the money is coming from. Similarly, we've been talking, Fatima and I were talking about state legislation. There can be state legislation, like it might be some ways more direct to go to the state and have that impact on the county, whether it's certain kinds of requirements or whether it's, some reform in policing or whether it's funding for mental health or for other kinds of needs. Sometimes that's another way to go. Or actually in Alameda County, the county government is, I think, pretty insular. It's resistant to change. There's a new supervisor from East County, but other than that, there's been the same supervisors in place for a long time. and they don't respond very well. But if the cities, so Oakland and Berkeley and Fremont and some other cities, are conducting these reimagining processes, right, where they're trying to reduce the level of policing and increase the capacity to respond to community emergencies, those could reduce the flow of people into the jail. And that could be a conscious objective of the processes in those cities. So there might be leverage at the city level to actually impact what happens at the county jail, because it's from within the cities where people are being, whether carrying out acts or not, but they're being arrested and charged and sent to the jail. So I think it is really important to look at different ways that there might be leverage in any of those situations. By Shane Bauer, that's right.
Thank you. And Stephen has put in the chat the link to that New York Times article. Thank you, Stephen. All right, I'm looking for hands.
I have my hand up.
Great, thanks, Helen. Go ahead.
I live in a town, Mr. Lindsay, where are you? I lost you. Anyway, I live in Mill Valley. Hi. And our city council is totally resistant to change. We have a DEI task force, which they're not listening to any one part of. So I'm wondering what is causing that. When you say, I've been curious about why they are so adamant against any kind of change.
So 2 questions. What does DEI stand for?
Oh, I'm sorry. Diversity, inclusion, equity, and they've had a whole study done. It's excellent. All the parents want the cops out of the schools. This is a small town, and we have a Black mayor who's elected by the city council. It's very complex, of course. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. But anyway, we have a new police chief who's just redacted all the crime reports. I mean, literally redacted them in the paper. They're blacked out.
Okay.
Okay. So what would be the driving force? I mean, fear, obviously, but fear of what?
Well, I guess I'm interested in understanding the driving force for change. Let's look at that first, right?
Yes.
Before we get to the resistance. So did this DEI task force come about after the protests last summer? Is that what led to its creation? Or was it an earlier creation?
No, it came about after the protests and after the commission refused to do anything. Black Lives Matter kept pushing. And so they said, well, we'll give it to a task force. We'll just
Yeah.
We'll let that lapse, which they're doing.
Okay. And who were the Black Lives Matter protests in Mill Valley? Who were the people who were pushing
I don't
that?
know, but the DEI folks, I can tell you, were incredibly professional. 22 people who hadn't worked together, but they're in all parts of the community. They were supported by every citizen who has talked publicly to the commission. Their report is specific, and some of it doesn't require a lot of money. So it can't all be money, but there's something about people's positions, I suppose, because they've always been on the council. They don't want to, like Trump's supporters, that they're afraid of their positions going.
But what is the principal demand of this task force? Or, what are the main things that they want to have happen?
In every area: police, housing, the arts commission. There's an arts commission even. And there's another one or two, but I can't remember. Anyway, because the housing is very inequitable here, as you can imagine. It's all but we do have Black people, and they say it's since Black Lives Matter, it's the first time they've even felt at all heard or welcomed.
Uh-huh.
Coming out of the woodwork.
I don't know how long it's a important question, and I'm not sure how to answer it, not knowing the community very well. But like I always, like I think power mapping is always like a really useful thing. Like, so where are the young people? Where are the women? Where are the undocumented folks? Who is being elected to power? Who votes? Who has businesses in the city? Like, and where are they? What is the relationship between this task force and all of those different people? Did this flame up and then flame down as a result of the pandemic, partly as a result of some other things? Did people lose focus? Like there's so many different pieces and ways to try to understand, okay, what is going on in order to think about what could move, like where was there conflict within the task force? Was the task force not close enough to other people in the community? Is there, the power mapping I think is really important, even in a small community like that.
Okay, I don't know about power mapping. That's very interesting. I mean, I've thought of parts of it. I've thought of some of the things you said, but I haven't heard that term, and that it needs to be on all different levels.
And do it collectively, right? Not just as an intellectual exercise, but in a group to say, okay, because different people might have different perceptions of where power is and how it's moving and how it's changing.
Okay.
But that might be, I don't know, like I don't, of course I've visited Mill Valley before, but I don't really know the community.
Welcome, you'd be welcome. We have a Mill Valley Community Action Network that started right after Trump was elected, and we can power map through them, and they have connections to all. I'm a newbie, I've only been here 8 years, and I do not have any connections to anybody. I don't have money, I don't have anything,
Well, you have connections now. Look, you're in a room with
you're
20 other people.
Pardon?
You're in a room with 20 other people.
Yeah, the Quakers. They're good connections. But that was an important question that you addressed. And, this has all happened since the recent killing, and Black Lives Matter sort of came into being. And they are younger, but the people on the DEI committee are all experienced people. They're not just kids. They're people of power. And serious people, and they've done a serious job, very professional. So I was trying to get to unravel this to get at it, but it's gonna
I do think that the role of young people is key, because they are often the most impacted, and they are often the most willing to ask obvious, deep questions about inequality. And act and take action,
So yeah, that makes sense, because we're mostly an aging community. This community is heavily weighted on older people, and so there aren't very many young people. So they probably the entrenched people probably think they can get away, which they can with more. But okay, so I need to go back to Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
Sure. I think we were going to do a poll, right, Barb?
Yes. I just wanted to see if there were any other last burning questions before we do our task here. Anybody just unmute and pop in, please? Okay, so when we started talking about this, John and the Social and Environmental Action Committee and the Racial Justice Action Team all wanted to do this and get information and then talk about what to do about it. And so what we've done tonight is created a poll, and what I would like is for you to answer the one question that will come up in just a second, and then we will share as a group what the interest level is on different ways to respond to these critical issues. So this is my first time, so bear with me. But
Barb, it's actually 5 questions. I broke it down in 5 questions.
Yes, you separated it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is 5 questions. So if you, and I'm talking about you, Helen, Tom, David, every person here can do something about mass incarceration or the demilitarization of police, or anything to do with racial justice, we would like to do a poll on what you would be interested in doing. So here's the poll. I'm going to launch it. But the first question is, I would feel led to commit to advocacy for demilitarization of police. Number 2, I would feel led to commit to advocacy to end mass incarceration. Number 3, I would feel led to commit to building community safety without police. And number 4, I would feel led to commit to study the history and impact of systemic racism. And lastly, I would feel led to commit to financially support a Black-led organization on a specific project, for example, education and housing. So I'm going to launch it. And then I believe, Jeannie, we have a few minutes to actually gather up the responses, right?
Yes.
All right, here we go. You have, let's see, no responses yet. So Jeannie, does it have a timer? Is there going to be a point where it stops, or is it just me?
No, no,
Okay.
that's up to you about when you want to end it.
All right. Well, let's just say.
And it won't show as voted until they've answered all the questions.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, so we'll give it one more minute. Thanks everybody for participating in this experiment.
And this is anonymous.
Yes, thank you. Okay, about 15 more seconds and then we'll share the results. So Jeannie, when I end the polling, it will display, right?
Yes, it will.
Great, thank you. Okay, you ready? Anybody need more time? Okay, drum roll, please. We're going to end the polling and share the results. Let me make it bigger. So 82% with demilitarization, 64% for mass incarceration, 64% for community safety without police, 82% for studying, and 64% for financial support.
Can you share that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I did. Excuse me. All this time, I thought you guys were looking at the same thing I was. There we go. Okay. 82, 64, 64, 82, and 64. All right, so that is the end of our regularly scheduled program. And I wanted to see if there were any questions about the poll or what we do next, because our team, the Racial Justice Action Team, will take this information, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from us as a meeting about next steps.
And we would just like to thank
Yes.
John and Fatima,
Yeah.
For a great presentation and such great questions and what appeared to be a great dialogue. And thanks, Barb, for organizing this.
Well, John,
Much appreciated.
Yeah, it was a thrill for me. And so, John, please tell Fatima that, how much we appreciate her presentation. And John, you're brilliant. I really appreciate you being here.
I will pass that on to her. Indeed. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
We'll
Yeah.
stay on for a
Thank
couple more
you.
minutes.
Thank you, John.
Yes.
Everybody.
Of course.
Barb, you should click where it says save the poll so you can save the results.
Yep, I was gonna
Okay.
do that. Thank
You're
you.
going to say something, Wendy?
And then,
Yes, Wendy.
the recording and the slides, will they be available through the team?
Oh, yeah. John, is that slide deck gonna be available?
I can make it available if you like.
Yeah. If
Yeah,
don't mind,
if you
just-
can send it to me, then we can put it on the meeting website under social justice.
Actually, so I sent you the link to the online
okay.
PowerPoint. I think you can use that.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Got it.
And, you know, I'll take the video and the recording and put it up.
And as I always say, for a small fee, right, Jeannie? Just kidding. All right.
Well, thanks,
Tom will be glad to
everybody.
know that I finally learned how to do that. So I worked on his from the climate change talk today.
Oh, cool. There's a lot of interest in this recording, so thank you.
Great.
One of our peeps is going to the Oakland Police Review Commission instead of being here. So we,
Oh, that's great.
yeah, we gave him our blessing so he can listen to the recording later. Anybody else?
Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
Thanks,
you, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you,
All right.
John.
So
Of
Jeannie,
course.
you'll
Thank
stay
you.
on.
Bye.
I will stay on.
John.
Yes. Yes.
All right.
Jeannie,
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeannie. I really appreciate your.
Oh, yeah. No problem. What a great event. 22, 21, 22 people. It's great.
Yeah, it's a good turnout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Wonderful turnout.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Good info.
And